Welcome back to C# Tutorials for Beginners. This time we're talking about the directory class. Last tutorial we went over file paths and the difference between absolute and relative paths. So now we're going to use both of these to kind of drive the point home with the directory class. So the first thing we need to learn how to do is to create a directory. And to do that, we use the directory class dot create directory. And then in the parentheses, what we want to pass is the file path that we want created. So for our first example, we're going to use absolute directory path as our file path, and that is going to create a folder called files inside of a folder called application that lives in the C drive. So if we take a look at my C drive, you'll see that I don't have a folder called application. And I wanted to do that because the create directory has the ability to create all of the folders that are missing along the way to get to your full path. So if you had 10 folders listed here that you wanted it to make, you could do that with one create directory call instead of creating the first directory and then creating the next one and so on and so forth. So let's see this in action. The first thing I want to do is add a write line that says done so we know when our directory has been created. And now let's run it. We get our done. And now if we look back at our C drive, you can see an application folder has been created. And inside the application, a files folder has been created. So to reiterate what just happened is we called directory.createDirectory and gave it this path. It looked and found that C existed. It did not find an application folder, so it created it. And then it went to the next one, files, and created it as well. Now we could have done the same thing with two create directory calls. We could have said create C application and then created C application files and did them one at a time, or we could send it this and do all of the folders that are missing at the same time. Next, let's do a create directory call on our relative directory path, which is just logs. So if we go to our project, open folder in File Explorer, go to our bin, debug, net 6.0, this is where our executable is running, so this is our relative path start. So now if we run this, we get done, and we go and look back at our .NET 6 folder, we see a logs folder has been created. So that works as we would expect. Just like with the other, we could say create logs/error logs, and we could run this. And then inside of logs will be a new folder, error logs. So you can also have multiple folders that are created in a relative path as well. So now that we know how to create directories, let's see how to look inside of them. So let's go in our error logs directory that we just created. Let's add a new text document, and I'm going to copy and paste this just several times so I can have a pile of files. So now let's say we want to get a list of all of our error logs in our logs folder that we've been keeping up with. We could say directory.getFiles. And we could give it our relative directory path, which is now our error logs path. And what that's going to return is a string array of file names. So if I put a breakpoint here and run this, our files array is going to be populated with names and paths of all of the files that it found inside of that directory. There's a lot of reasons we may want to do that. You may want to show the user what all files are in a directory, or you may want to read all of the contents out of them, and doing those things, manipulating those files, we'll go over that next video. The next thing I want to go over is the exists method. So if you say directory.exists, and then give it a directory, which will give it the relative path, that is going to return a Boolean of whether or not that directory exists. Now the exists method can come in handy in a couple of different ways. So if you look at the getFiles method, you can throw a directory not found exception. So say we've already created our directories and we're trying to look for our error logs, but we give it the wrong path. So let's say logs2, which doesn't exist, and now we're trying to get files out of a folder that doesn't exist. What's going to happen is we're going to throw a directory not found exception. Now I want to be clear, if you get a directory not found exception like this, you need to track down why the directory wasn't found. It may be that you forgot to initialize something, or there's another error somewhere else, and you don't want to just put a band-aid on that here. But sometimes you get to a place where a directory may or may not exist. And if that's the case, we can say if our directory exists, Then and only then do we try to get our files. And of course, we have to put our variable in a different scope and set it if our if passes. And then we could use our files, and if it's not found, we can do something else, and that would depend on what our application is trying to do. The next thing I want to point out is that the create directory method has a built-in exists check. It creates all directories and subdirectories in the specified path unless they already exist. So you don't need to do an exists check before you create a directory, because it will create it if it doesn't exist, and it will not overwrite it if it already exists. That being said, that doesn't mean create directory can't still throw a directory not found exception. So say your user is giving us this path and we're trying to create the directory based on that input. Well, what if they gave us a path where the drive letter doesn't exist? So when we run this, it's going to give us directory not found exception, because while it can create files and it can create application, it cannot create the L drive. And that brings me to my next point, which is how important it is to error handle anything dealing with the file system. Directory, file IO, any of that, you need to error handle it. Now, in general, there is usually a way to check every scenario without relying on an error handler finding it for you. We could say string root equals directory dot get directory root, pass it the absolute directory path, and then when we ran this, it would take the root off of our directory root, and we could check to see if that existed. We could do that, but it all comes down to the number of scenarios, and more importantly, everyone's machine is different. You could have 100 users creating directories with your application, but then you might run into one that have extremely strict permissions on their file system, and when you try to call create directory, you get an unauthorized access exception. While I'm not going to go into specific error handling since there's already another tutorial video for that, I will recommend that every time you do something different, like creating a directory versus getting the files out of it, I would recommend using a different try catch. So if you do run into something very specific to a machine, it's a lot easier to track down what's actually happening. Okay, so moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is the move method. And I'm going to comment all of this out, kind of get it out of the way. And what we are going to call is directory.move. So there's a couple of important things to mention about the move function. The first is that it takes a source directory and a destination directory and it moves from one to the other. It does not copy. So once the move is finished, your original directory will be gone. The next thing to be aware of is that the destination path has to exist up to the destination folder. It will create the destination folder, but if it's missing part of the path before it, it will throw a directory not found exception. So to give an example, let's copy and paste our relative directory path. Let's call the second one our destination relative directory path. Let's take the 2 off of our logs. And let's say we want to move logs/error logs to logs/backup logs. Now we need to pass into our move function our source path and our destination path. And if we look back at our folder, we have our error logs folder here. Now when we run this and it's done, you can see that it has already changed itself to backup logs. So now our error logs folder is gone and we have a backup logs folder. So while that worked, if we had made this say logs/backup/backup logs, this would have thrown an exception because we would have needed to create this directory first before we tried moving this directory into this directory. Okay, the last thing I'm going to go over in this tutorial is the delete method. So let's get rid of our destination path and let's change our relative path to be our backup logs because that's what we moved it to. And now we are going to call the directory.delete method. The thing to be aware of about the delete method is that it only deletes an empty directory when you provide a file path. So if I give it our relative path, we know that we have log files in our backup logs path. So if we run this call, we are going to get an IO exception because our directory is not empty. And this is good because you can't accidentally blow away a whole bunch of files and folders in this path if you didn't mean to. Now you can by providing a second argument Boolean, which is a recursive flag, meaning it will go through every directory in your directory and all of the files within those, and it will go all the way down, deleting everything it finds. So if we do this and run this, then we go back, and our .NET 6 logs has nothing in it because we have deleted /backup logs and everything inside of it. Now, as usual, the directory class has more methods, which you can go and look and see what they do. There's some pretty useful stuff in there. But I tried to give you everything that a beginner needs to start dealing with the file system. So next up, we are finally starting to read, write, and manipulate the files themselves. So thank you for watching, everybody. I do appreciate you. I hope this is helpful. Happy coding, and until next time, as always, take care.